The bow got in the wardrobe. Malfoy didn't reappear in classes until late Thursday morning. When the Slytherin and Gryffindors were halfway through the double potions, he swaggered into the dungeon, his arm covered in bandages, bound up like a sling, acting like, in Harry's opinion, as though it were a heroic survivor of some dreadful battle. "How's Draco?" simpered Pansy Parkinson. How is it, Draco? Did it hurt much?" "Yeah," said Malfoy, putting on a brave sort of grimace. But Harry saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle when Pansy looked away. Settle down, said Professor Snape idly. Harry and Ron scowled at each other. Snape wouldn't have said settle down if they'd walk in late. He'd have given them a detention. But Malfoy had always been able to get away with anything in Snape's class. Snape was the head of Slytherin House and generally favored by his own students above all others. They were making a new potion today, shrinking solution. Malfoy set up his cauldron right next to Harry and Ron, so that they were preparing the ingredients on the same table. Sir, Malfoy called. Sir, I'll need help cutting up these daisy roots because of my arm. Weasley, cut up Malfoy's roots for him, said Snape without looking up. Ron went brick red. There's nothing wrong with your arm, he hissed at Malfoy. Malfoy smirked across the table. Weasley, you heard Professor Snape. Cut up these roots. Ron seized the knife, pulled Malfoy's roots towards him, and began to chop them roughly so that they were all in different sizes. Professor, drawled Malfoy, Weasley's mutilating my roots, sir. Snape approached the table, stared down, and looked his hooked nose at the roots. Then he gave Ron an unpleasant smile from beneath his long, greasy black hair. Strange roots with Malfoy, Weasley. But, sir, Ron had spent the last quarter of an hour carefully shredding his own roots into exact equal pieces. Now, said Snape, in his most dangerous voice. Ron shoved his own beautifully cut roots across the table at Malfoy, then took up the knife again. And, sir, I'll need this the shrivel fig skinned, said Malfoy, his voice full of malice and laughter. Potter, can you skin Malfoy's shrivel fig? Said Snape, giving Harry a look of loathing, as he always reserved just for him. Harry took Malfoy's shrivel-rig, and Ron began trying to repair the damage he had done to the roots. Now they had no use. Harry skinned the shrivel-fig as fast as he could and flung it back across the table at Malfoy without speaking. Malfoy was smirking more broadly than ever. Seen your pal Hagrid lately? He asked them quietly. None of your business, said Ron jerkily, without looking up. I'm afraid he won't be teaching here much longer, said Malfoy in a tone of mock sorrow. Father's not very happy about my injury. Keep talking, Malfoy. I'll give you a real injury, snarled Ron. He's complained to the school governors and the Ministry of Magic. Father's got a lot of influence, you know. And last thing, injury like this, gave a huge fake sigh. Who knows if my arm will ever be the same again? So that's why you're putting it on, said Harry, accidentally beheading a dead caterpillar because his hand was shaking in anger. To try to get Hagrid fired? Well, said Malfoy, lowering his voice in a whisper, partly, Potter. But there are other benefits, too. Weasley sliced my caterpillars for me. A few cauldrons away, Neville was in trouble. Neville regularly went to pieces in potions class. It was the worst subject, and his great fear of Professor Snape made things 10 times worse. His potion was supposed to be bright acid green, had turned orange, Longbottom, said Snape, ladling some of it up, allowing it to splash back into the cauldron so that everyone could see. Orange? Tell me, boy. Penetrate that thick skull of yours. Didn't you hear me say quite clearly, that only one rat spleen was needed. Didn't I state plainly that a dash of leech juice would suffice? What do I have to do to make you understand, Longbottom? Neville was pink and trembling. He looked as though he was going to on the verge of tears. Please, sir, said Hermione. Please, I could help Neville put it right. I don't remember asking you to show off, Miss Granger, said Snape coldly, and Hermione went pink as well as Neville. Longbottom, at the end of this lesson we will feed a few drops of this potion to your toad to see what happens. Perhaps that will encourage you to do it properly. Snape moved away, leaving Neville breathless with fear. Help me, he moaned to Hermione. Hey, Harry, said Seamus Finnegan, leaning over to bow Harry's brass scales. Have you heard? Daily Prophet this morning. They reckon that Sirius Black's been sighted. Where? Said Harry and Ron quickly. On the other side of the table, Malfoy looked up, listening closely. Not too far from here, said Seamus, who looked excited. It was a muggle who saw him. Course, he didn't really understand. The muggle think that he's just an ordinary criminal, don't they? So she phoned the telephone hotline. By the time the Ministry of Magic got there, he was gone. Not too far from here, Ron repeated, looking significantly at Harry. He turned around and saw Malfoy watching closely. What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned? But Malfoy's eyes were thinning malevolently, and they were fixed on Harry. He leaned across the table. Thinking of trying to catch Black single-handed, Potter? Yeah, that's right, Harry said offhandedly. Malfoy's thin mouth was curving into a mean smile. Of course it was me, he said quietly. I'd done some things before now. I wouldn't be staying in school like a good boy. I'd go out looking for him. What the heck are you talking about, Malfoy? Rod said roughly. Don't you know, Potter? Breathed Malfoy, his pale eyes narrow. Know what? Malfoy let out a loud sneering laugh. Maybe you'd rather not risk your neck, he said. Want to leave it to the Dementors, do you? But if it was me, I would want revenge. I'd want to hunt him down myself. What are you talking about? Said Harry angrily. But at that moment Snape called, You should have finished adding your ingredients by now. This potion needs to stew before it can be drunk. So clear away while it simmers, and we'll test Longbottoms. Crabbe Goyle laughed openly, watching Neville's sweat as he stirred his potion feverishly. Hermione was muttering instructions to him out of the corner of her mouth so that Snape wouldn't see. Harry and Ron packed away from their unused ingredients that went into the wash their hands and their ladles and their stone bases in the corner. What did Malfoy mean? Harry muttered to Ron as he stuck his hands in the icy jet that poured from the gargoyle's mouth. Why would I want revenge on Black? He hasn't done anything to me, yet. Oh, he's making it up, said Ron savagely. He's trying to make you do something stupid. The end of the lesson in sight, Snape strode over to Neville's to see who was covering his cauldron. Everyone gather round, said Snape, his black eyes glittering, and watch what happens to Longbottom's toad. If he manages to produce a shrinking solution, it will shrink into a tadpole. If, as I doubt, he has done something wrong, the toad will likely be poisoned. The Gryffindors watched fearfully. The Slytherins looked excited. Snape picked up Trevor the toad in his left hand and dripped a small spoon into Neville's potion, which was now green. He tricked a few drops down Trevor's throat. This was the moment of hushed silence, in which Trevor gulped. There was a small pulp, and Trevor the tadpole was wriggling in Snape's palm. The Gryffindor burst into applause. Snape looked sour, pulled a small bottle from his pocket of his robe, poured a few drops on the top of Trevor, and he reappeared suddenly full grown. 5 points from Gryffindor, said Snape, which wiped the smiles off everyone. I told you not to help him, Miss Granger. Class dismissed. Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the steps of the entrance hall. Harry was still thinking about Malfoy had said, while Ron was seething about Snape. 5 points from Gryffindor because the potion was right. Ugh. Why didn't you lie, Hermione? You should have said Neville did it all himself. Hermione didn't answer. Ron looked around. Where is she? Harry turned too. They're at the top of the steps now, watching the rest of the class pass by, heading for the Great Hall and launch. She was right behind us, said Ron, frowning. Malfoy passed them, walking between Crabbe and Goyle, and he smirked and and then disappeared. There she is, said Harry. Hermione was panting slightly, hurrying up the stairs, one hand clutching her bag, the other one tucking something down in her front of her robes. How did you do that? Said Ron. What? Said Hermione, joining them. 1 minute you were right behind us, and the next moment you're back at the bottom of the stairs again. What? Hermione looked slightly confused. Oh, I had to go back for something. Oh, no. A seam split Hermione's bag. Hermione wasn't surprised. Or Harry wasn't surprised. He could see was crammed with at least a dozen large and heavy books. Why are you carrying them all around with you? Ron asked her. You know how many subjects I'm taking? Said Hermione breathlessly. Couldn't hold on these for you, could you? But Ron was turning over the books in his hand. She handed him, looking at the covers. You haven't got any of these subjects today. It's only defensive against outside this afternoon. Oh, yes, said Hermione vaguely. Then she packed all the books back into the bag just the same. I hope there's something good for lunch. I'm starving, she added, and she marched off towards the Great Hall. Do you get the feeling Hermione's not telling us something? Ron asked Harry. Professor Lupin wasn't there when they arrived for their first defense against dark arts lesson. They all sat down, looking at their books and quills and parchment, and where they were walking. When they finally entered the room, Lupin smiled vaguely and placed his tatty old briefcase on the teacher's desk. He was as shabby as ever, but he looked healthier than he had on the train, as though he had had a few square meals. Good afternoon, he said. Would you please put all your books in your bags? Today will be a practical lesson. You will need only your wands. A few curious looks exchanged. Class put away their books, and they'd never had a practical defense against dark arts before, unless you counted the memorable class last year when the old teacher had brought out the cage full of pixies to the class and set them loose. Right then, said Professor Lupin, when everyone was ready. If you'd follow me. Puzzled but interested, the class got to their feet and followed Professor Lupin out of the classroom, led them into the deserted corridor around the corner, and there the first thing they saw was Peeves, the poltergeist, who was floating upside down in midair, stuffing the nearest keyhole with chewing gum. Peeves didn't look up until Professor Lupin was 2 feet away. Then he wriggled his curly little toad feet and broke into a song. Loony loopy loopin', Peeves sang. Loony loony loopin', loony loopin', loony loopin'. Rude and unimaginable, as he almost always was, Peeves usually showed some respect towards teachers. Everyone looked quickly at Professor Lupin to see where he would take this, and to his surprise he was smiling. Oh, I'd take that gum out of the keyhole if I were you, Peeves, he said pleasantly. Mr. Filch won't be able to get to his brooms. Filch, the Hogwarts caretaker, a bad-tempered, failed wizard, who waged a constant war against the students and indeed Peeves. However, Peeves had paid no attention to Professor Lupin's words, except to blow a loud, wet raspberry. Professor Lupin gave a small sigh and took out his wand. This is a useful spell, he told the class over his shoulder. Please watch closely. He raised his wand to shoulder height. What a stay! And he pointed at at Peeves. With the force of a bullet, the wad of chewing gum shot out of the keyhole and straight down Peeves' left nostril, which whirled up right, and zoomed away cussing. Cool, sir, said Thomas in amazement. Said Dean Thomas in amazement. Thank you, Dean, said Professor Lupin, putting his wand away. Shall we proceed?